I think for Boston, obviously they were clearly willing to pay two guys $60+ million since they pursued Giannis Antetokounmpo, but there's a line. Clearly, there's a line. They're willing to pay a top 10 level player that much money. Jason Tatum, they perceive as that. Giannis Antetokounmpo is undoubtedly that. But Jaylen Brown, clearly Boston does not perceive as being that level of player. Here's the one thing I'll say, just to add some context to Jaylen Brown. I didn't report this in the middle of the season, but I heard this in the middle of the season, that Boston went into the 2025-26 season planning on selling high on Jaylen Brown if an offer was out there that made sense. But then plans changed. They were on a 50+ win pace. Jason Tatum was healthy enough to come back, and they knew we would come back in March. It happened, and they're like, you know what? We'll just stick with it and keep rolling this year and see what happens in the playoffs. And sometimes the plans you have end up changing. That's what happened for Boston this past season. But they went into last season with a plan like, hey, we could sell high on Jaylen this year. With Jason Tatum being out, he could be in a position where we want to be in the lottery. Let's sell high on Jaylen Brown and get a good return. And ended up that they let it go into the summer, and they almost get Giannis Antetokounmpo, and then they miss, and they end up not selling high, but they still sold. They still decided to get rid of Jaylen Brown for a return that pretty much everybody unanimously, except for some of the analytics extremists, believe is a negative return for Boston. So I do wonder, from the Boston side of things, I said this on my emergency pod last night, Tom, and I know you wrote about it on Yahoo Sports as well. So I look forward to talking about this point with you, because if the Celtics are proven to be in the right by making this decision, if we look back a year from now or 5 years from now and we're like, oh, wow, Brad Stevens is a genius. Brad Stevens won the deal. Why would that be? And I think you can look at the Paul George side of it. Paul George is a 40% guy on catch and shoot threes. Jaylen Brown, 35%, a better spot up shooter. You can look at last year, 25 games with Philadelphia. Paul George was the more efficient pick and roll scorer. He was the more efficient isolation scorer. Jaylen Brown was far less efficient in those play types. So they're going from a higher volume, average efficiency Jaylen Brown to a lower volume, higher efficiency Paul George. And then where is the compensation coming from with the rest of the roster? And as you wrote about on Yahoo Sports, this might be a bet on Peyton Pritchard. So, Tom, what did you find in your research about how Boston might be thinking about this move and what it could mean for the rest of the roster, absorbing that open now volume, the touches that are going to be just absent without Jaylen Brown there?
Well, let me first off just mention that, Derek White is catching a lot of flack here from Brian Windhorst's comments last night in the emergency pod that he did, that Brian Windhorst is making the connecting the dots here, saying the Celtics did not feel like Jaylen had the best season on their team. They felt that Derek White had a better season. I also think you can look at Team USA. In 2024, after he won a finals MVP, who was left off the Team USA roster and who was put onto it? It was Derek White, not Jaylen Brown. And he felt a certain way about that. And Grant Hill went on the record to explain that, is that they wanted a better on-ball defender, a guy that would be playing high-energy defense. And Derek White and Drew Holiday made more sense on that front, filling a roster spot with those two guys rather than Jaylen Brown. And so you can look at this and say the Boston Celtics feel like they have a redundancy in Jaylen Brown's skill set, which is he's a high-volume, high isolation guy, dribble drive guy, not a great three-point shooter. They have Jason Tatum. They had Derek White, who did not have a good three-point shooting system, but defensively much better than Jaylen Brown. And then there's Peyton Pritchard. I know he's kind of, people laugh at the notion that he could be a mini Jalen Brunson. I'm not saying he's going to be a finals MVP and an all-NBA player. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm saying is, when you look at the numbers and when you watch him, the guy is a bucket getter. And we saw Jalen Brunson go from a Dallas Mavericks team as a backup, could not get the right oxygen and minutes to prove that he is an all-star caliber player until he left to go to New York. And then he showed, hey, everyone thinks I'm undersized, I'm not big enough, but I got the footwork and the jump shot and the tenacity to be an all-league type player. And I think the Boston Celtics are not saying Peyton Pritchard's better than Jaylen Brown. I am not saying that. And that's what I wrote. I wrote the Celtics probably do not think that Peyton Pritchard is better than Jaylen Brown. But Peyton Pritchard's making $7 million a year, $8 million a year. He's on one of the best contracts in the league. And by the way, in the games in which Jaylen Brown did not play, Peyton Pritchard was an all-league level, statistically, all-league level player, averaging 25 points a game, 7 assists, and 5 rebounds in those 10 games last year. And he was a sixth man of the year 2 years ago. And the numbers don't lie when it comes to Peyton Pritchard's potential to break out next season. When he is playing outside of Jaylen Brown, he's absolutely scoring 20, 25 points per 36 minutes. He's a bucket getter. And Jaylen Brown is making more in 1 month next season than Peyton Pritchard will make in the entire season.
Crazy.
So
$7
if you're
million
looking at
next
this
year for Peyton Pritchard, just a tiny fraction of what he'd get on the open market.
It's incredible. So Brad Stevens has to look at this and say, under a hard salary cap, because that's what it is, under a hard salary cap system, does it make more sense to have Peyton Pritchard using up a lot of those touches and those dribble drives? He's the second most efficient scorer on ISOs last season. And you got Jaylen Brown, who, let's face it, a high volume isolation scorer, but they were scoring at a higher rate, a better rate when he was off the floor and Derek White and Peyton Pritchard were leading that offense. It's just, I think Peyton Pritchard's going to have the ability to break out next season. And I am not saying that he's going to be all NBA, but I am saying that the Boston Celtics looked at the situation and said, I think we can make up our offense without Jaylen Brown and be just fine. I think there is a high potential that the Ewing theory coined by Bill Simmons could be at play here, that the Celtics actually have a better record next season than this year because of the allocation of those skill sets. And I do think that the Mitch Robinson deal is going to be a big improvement for them next year. And I think Peyton Pritchard is going to be a big reason why I will take the over on whatever the win-loss projection is from Vegas. I think you could see a breakout season from Peyton Pritchard and better allocation of the skill sets in Boston without Jaylen Brown. And you know who also agrees with me? Is Brad Stevens, Team USA, and all the other owners and GMs who did not bite at getting Jaylen Brown at the number that he's at.
And definitely whoever Bobby Marks talked to as well. Definitely whoever he spoke to. Seventh best player on the team. But regarding Pritchard, one of the screenshots you had on your story was a graphic from Data Baller looking at Peyton Pritchard's numbers per 75 possessions versus with Jaylen Brown on the floor versus without Jaylen Brown on the floor. And without Jaylen Brown last season, Peyton Pritchard averaged 27 points, 7.6 assists, 5 boards on 61% true shooting. Nearly 40% from three as well. Plus, there are plus 9.6 in those minutes as well. We all know about the plus minus with and without Jaylen, but individually, Peyton Pritchard is somebody I know, like one of the best Celtics reporters out there, Noah Dalzell. She gets ragged on sometimes a few years ago for saying Peyton Pritchard will be an all-star someday. If it's going to happen, it's going to be this year that Peyton Pritchard becomes an all-star and that Noah will look like a genius with great foresight for the future with that prediction a few years ago that she made. And I think with Pritchard, as you said, he was a sixth man of the year. Last year, he became a starter and maintained his efficiency and was very productive. And then this coming season, I think Boston, that's what their bet is. I don't like the return in a vacuum. I think they should have gotten more for Jaylen Brown, and I think there's so much you can poke holes at with how they botched this and screwed it up. But I think if they're proven right, it's going to be because Paul George is a more efficient role player. Jaylen Brown, will not play a small role, and that what's lost in volume from go-to scoring in Jaylen Brown would be compensated for with a little bit of Paul George, a little bit more Jason Tatum, a lot more Peyton Pritchard, and who knows what other ways in which we'll see them revise their system as well. So, look, I'm not ruling out that Boston ends up looking very smart in this situation. But at the end of the day, though, Tom, the best player in the deal is Jaylen Brown, and he's going to the Philadelphia 76ers, and this is undoubtedly an upgrade for their roster.